with an even dozen. This is, by our count, the 12th day of doing the Writ Race, and welcome in Dave Trafford here with John Wright. And as we usually do on a Friday, where we have the On the Ledge podcast, Keith Leslie is one of our co-hosts, and they're joining us this morning. How are you, Keith?
Just great, thanks. Just great.
A couple things. I do want to get into the provincial focus of, how this is playing out, because I think as much in all as there's a narrative out there that the provinces are sort of standing back and doing their thing. Doing nothing affects the strategy on the federal campaign, so we will get into some of that. But yesterday, we were talking about, John, you and I, the situation in Kabul and the attack at the airport, the American troops that were killed in that attack, that we had, an ongoing issue around the Taliban providing security, ISIS involved, all of this just bringing to a crescendo the Afghan story. And almost right out of the gate, you noted that Afghanistan is now the ballot question. How do they manage this? Well, you had specific advice for Mr. O'Toole in terms of, if you were advising O'Toole, what would you tell him?
And I think if I were advising Erin O'Toole, this is not a day for politics. This is a day for reflection on who we are as people. And I think if Erin O'Toole is going to have the right impact, it's effectively to stand back from it all and say, we're better than this. When the world calls upon us, we don't sit back and pencil push. We actually step up and we go and do something to help people. And we've left people behind. And I as a leader don't want my country to be like that. I think it's that kind of a thing where he doesn't necessarily attack Trudeau, because Trudeau's going to get attacked all over the place. But this is his potential moment to have a sense of not futility, but a sense of judgment and looking forward to say, this is how we should act.
And a few hours later, Mr. O'Toole, from his town hall bunker in Ottawa, I think, issued this video, and this is an excerpt from it, on Twitter.
The path forward is one of grief, difficulty, and uncertainty. There are and there will be no easy decisions. There will be a time for questions about how we found ourselves in this situation, how our government failed to heed the warnings. But this is not it. Now is the time for us to come together as a country. Now is the time to ask what we can do to bring people home. These are the people who've risked everything to help us. Interpreters who answered the call to support our troops, who kept Canadians safe, who risked their lives for us.
And then he wraps up, it's about a 3-minute statement, and he wrapped up not only with just that tone and saying we need to come together. He offers 3 things that we should be doing and can be doing right now.
Here are 3 concrete things that we can do right now. Number 1, rededicate ourselves to work with our allies and Afghanistan's neighbors to help anyone able to flee the Taliban. Number 2, work with our allies, including India, to establish humanitarian and refugee corridors. Number 3, provide political and material support to Afghans resisting the Taliban occupation. We must not stop in our efforts to stand up for those who stood with us.
So a couple of things are clear here, Keith. John Wright is clearly in the bag with the Conservatives. No doubt about it.
Someone's listening.
But I think that the tone was correct. I think the messaging was correct. But here's what's interesting to me. Shortly after John and I had our conversation, I saw the defense minister sing On with Evan Solomon on CTV. And he's asking the minister exactly the same kind of questions. What are you about to do? What are you going to do? For the most part, the minister had the same message in terms of what we're going to do and reach out to other governments and help these people get out and blah, 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 blah. But it sounded far more defensive when he said it, because he had to be prompted and prodded by a bulldog like Evan Solomon. It felt like he was pulling teeth, as opposed to what O'Toole did and kind of stood up straight and said, this is what we should be doing. It's not the time for politics. Let's do 1, 2, 3 and do this all together. Same message, completely different framing and I think an effect.
Oh, absolutely. O'Toole's statement was masterful. I mean, let's face it, saying this is not a time to find out why we failed in Afghanistan and left these people behind, that's a shot at the government, but it was the right way of taking it and then moving on quickly and saying, now's the time to come together, and here's some 3 very constructive things we can do. I think things that Canadians would agree with. He looked very, very statesmanlike doing that. And as you say, the Minister of Defense, Mr. Singh, looked very defensive because he is in a defensive position and saying, well, let's not look at that right now. Let's, blame later. Let's look ahead and here's what we can do. Essentially the same message, but coming from the government versus coming from the opposition leader who's campaigning to lead the next government. I think the impact was huge, huge for Mr. O'Toole, especially when we had a Liberal cabinet minister this week refer to the Taliban as our brothers. Those two, I think that if Kabul wasn't going to be a ballot question, those 2 events pivoted it right to the top.
Yeah, John, and you clearly made that point right out of the gate yesterday as soon as this happened and we were talking about it. This brings us back almost to day one, though, where there was not a ballot question. The government, the Liberals didn't do anything necessarily to define that, and they have allowed, even with the same messaging and the same subject matter, O'Toole to define it far more clearly for Canadians. Moving forward, we're back to that heart and head kind of thing that I think Canadians are starting to look at in this, and they're taking O'Toole more seriously than we might have otherwise thought.
Yeah, and I want to address it in a couple of ways. Number one, when we say ballot question, I actually don't refer to it that way in terms of a ballot question that we're going to vote on directly in an election campaign. This is a ballot question about character. This is something that is going to define the moment, as we talked about yesterday. It's a defining moment. And I had the great privilege of working with Senator Hugh Segal for 6 years. Left a senatorial. I was right out of, I did an internship at Queen's Park and then 2 years at a job, and then I went to work for Hugh. And Hugh left me with one clear thing, and that is sometimes you just have to do the right thing. I mean, you hope to do the right thing all the time, but in politics, sometimes you just have to do that. And the contrast, Dave, between what was the 2 statements yesterday by the Prime Minister and by Mr. O'Toole were character defining, in my view. On the one hand, we had the, air quote, a prime ministerial type statement made by Erin O'Toole, and you never get a second chance to make a first impression. And a lot of people are taking a look at Mr. O'Toole and saying, okay, this is who he is. Interesting. Contrast that with what looked to be a manufactured selfie with the Prime Minister close up, basically saying, look, seniors, we're going to give you lots more money. I mean, it was almost like, some hawker who was out there on the campaign trail when he still is Prime Minister. He still has the keys to the government. I mean, he can't call back Parliament. You just can't do that. You're not allowed to do that. But he has the keys to do things. And I think that this is a turning point, maybe not so much on a political scale as it is the defining moment where a lot of elites look at this and then filter it to other people. So I think I'm going to be looking at the polls next Monday, not immediately, to see what kind of an impact this has on it. But I think what Erin O'Toole and his team did yesterday was absolutely, as you said, was masterful, and it's exactly how it should be portrayed by the Liberals, and it didn't, and it isn't, and it's going to catch up with them.
Without sounding crass on this, Keith, there couldn't have been worse timing for the Liberals because we're heading into a weekend, and a weekend where people are going to get together and there's going to be conversation about a variety of things. Now, I have heard more discussion about the Afghan story from just general folks in my circle who aren't, down in the weeds like the 3 of us are, who are thinking, what the hell's going on there? The more that they dig into it, the more angry they get about how this has been handled. So I think that we're going into a weekend only amplifies and expands the life cycle of the story.
Well, we're in a situation where people are trying to squeeze basically, another 10, 12 days out of summer if they possibly can without really thinking about politics a lot. And if they are thinking about anything, it is Afghanistan and Kabul and what went on. And of course, even if they weren't thinking about that, the bombings, the explosions Thursday, that changed everyone. Everyone is now paying attention to this. They have no choice. And as you say, we're going into a weekend. This is what people are going to be talking about. How on earth did we leave people behind? How did we close our operations a week before the Americans are done pulling people out? And this bombing, this massive amount of deaths, it's just so shocking to see that. It shouldn't be shocking to us, I know, but we think, there's some sort of, I wouldn't loathe to call it a peaceful transfer of power in Afghanistan, but things were supposed to go a little bit better than suicide bombings taking out dozens and dozens of people, including U.S. Soldiers. It's just so shocking, and I think that's the kind of thing that people, if they are discussing this weekend, if they're looking at the election at all, it'll be in the context of that and the responses we saw. That sort of very manufactured, smooth Mr. Trudeau versus Mr. O'Toole, seemingly very prime ministerial, very statesmanlike, and very leader-like. Just saying the right things that need to be said at the right time. Here's what we should do. I think the contrast there will remain in most people's minds if they see that during the weekend. And as John said, it's the kind of thing that does get filtered down, and this weekend is a perfect time to allow that sort of thing to get down. People are rightly shocked and outraged that what has gone on in Kabul, that we haven't been able to get our people out of there. And O'Toole's suggestion, well, let's work with all the neighbors and let's get people out of that country any way we can.
I just want to echo what Dave said. My wife and I were walking the dog last night in dusk time, and a woman came up to me and said, I heard you on the radio earlier this morning, and I want to tell you my feelings about what's happening in Afghanistan and leaving people behind. And she said, my husband and I are just absolutely overtaken by this, and we're so upset, and we wish we could do something. I haven't talked to this woman probably in years. Like, she was listening on the radio to this. And so to your point, this is, as we said yesterday, this is going to go through a cycle of 3 or 4 days. You are not going to be able to get away from it at all. Secondly, can the Liberals recover from this? And I'm only speaking from a political point of view. Yes, they can, because we have a long time to go in this campaign. But I don't think they can. I don't think they can do that unless we have the Prime Minister who is addressing some of these issues, as opposed to Trudeau campaigning. And that's the difference. So they still have, as I said, the government can match funding with certain groups that are trying to raise money, to get to house these interpreters. They can do a bunch of things. And unless they do that, this will be the stain on their campaign.
Yeah, except you know what? When we kind of go back to the reason that we're in this campaign to begin with is that look in the rearview mirror and say what a great job we did in COVID. The answer universally has been you were just doing your job. So it doesn't matter. I don't think, John. I think they're going to have to create an entirely different narrative because dealing with Afghanistan will be qualified as just doing your job. So the longer that they hold back on that, I think that it makes it far more difficult to get out from underneath it. To just hold status quo, they've got to do something.
Yeah, but you and I are agreeing. They have to do something. They have to do something that looks like, again, he's the Prime Minister of Canada. He can't take a holiday from doing the work of a nation. He has to stop for a moment being Mr. Campaigner and actually not necessarily respond directly to Erin O'Toole, but as the leader of a nation, he has to say, we are doing the following things. He's got to get serious for a moment instead of doing selfies and talking about giving out money to people.
But his priority seems to be his talent for working a crowd. That's the big defense now we hear from everything. Yes, okay, he's down in the polls. The Conservatives are actually edging ahead. But Trudeau can work a crowd like no one else. And it's true. He absolutely can. I've seen it up close. It's really, really something to watch. But when you've got no issue for your campaign, when you're campaigning to get a majority, and then this stuff happens to you, Afghanistan happens, and you have to react to it, and you react to it by staying on the campaign trail, as opposed to, as John suggests, acting as a government leader should act, that is just the wrong way to be going at this point in time, and it's so obvious to everyone. If we cast back to the beginning of the week before the Afghanistan was really top of mind for most people, we had that Chrysler Freeland video of where they took O'Toole's statement on healthcare, and my God, if I as a journalist had ever edited anything together like that, I'd have been sued, taken to court, and pleaded guilty, because it was just so long, so misleading. But O'Toole, of course, he wasn't great in the response to it. What it did highlight in the end, this was obviously a liberal wedge. They like to pull this one out every time. But in the end, it highlighted the fact that there's virtually no difference between the Liberals and Conservatives on healthcare policy. That's what it comes down. Other than funding the provinces going ahead at different dollar amounts, that's really the only difference. On this whole suggestion of private involvement in private sector delivery, there's virtually no difference. This was another failed effort by the Liberals, I think, to get O'Toole to step on another rake, and he didn't do a great job of it, but they didn't do a great job of it either.
There are people who obviously, Keith, I'm totally with you, who say that Trudeau can work a crowd. But there's also the case that the Liberals have indicated directly or subtly at the same time that there's going to be no shake-up or changes at the campaign level. I mean, that's now evident. I guess the only thing I say to those people is, how's it working for you so far? Because you're down, in some cases you're down 12 points now, not just 10 points, and you're falling behind some of the polls that are now coming out. So, if you just want to keep doing same old, buddy, you're going to end up at about 28%. And you're going to be nowhere near getting close to even a minority unless you can make some changes. And it doesn't look like they're making any changes.
Well, I heard Scott Reid commenting on that earlier this morning, and he is, of course, a former advisor to Prime Minister Paul Martin. And when asked to say, what do you think of this comment from those in the war room that there won't be any changes? And he said, that entirely means watch for huge changes early next week.
And he would know. That's exactly what it means, because the campaigning on, Mr. Trudeau is a great man and can work a crowd. That's not going to get you over this right now. Mm-hmm. And the polls are picking up the conservative, the Liberal fall and the conservative gains here. They weren't even picking that up in Nova Scotia in the summer campaign. It came as a complete surprise. We're watching this here federally. If the polls are already catching it week 2, what does this really mean for the Liberal campaign? I think, as you said, Mr. Reid said, it means big changes starting next week.
Yeah. And he pointed to other campaigns where they had to do that, and they recovered in some cases you don't. But to think that you're just going to sort of rotate while all this is going on is a little politically naive. Okay, so let's take this to the Ontario perspective now, because earlier this week, Keith, it was reported that the Premier, Doug Ford, calling on his cabinet to pretty much stay out of it, stay on the sidelines, don't even get involved in any of the local campaigning in their neighborhoods, nothing to do with the federal campaign. And the thinking was, because you've got jobs to do right now, we're into the fourth wave, focus on the work at hand here in this province. To me, it sounds like a well-framed message for his frontliners. And getting involved in this campaign, there's no upside for him.
No, absolutely not. There's no upside for either side. The federal Conservatives don't really want to tangle with the provincial Conservatives in Ontario or most other places right now either. And there is no upside for the provincial Conservatives to get involved in this federal campaign. I think if anyone's going to, it's going to be Doug Ford himself, but he's been missing in action for weeks before the federal campaign was even called. He certainly seems to be wanting to stay low profile now, but to have his people stay out of it, that makes infinite sense. And to say, you do have a job to do, and the Premier has a job to do, and that's concentrate on the fourth wave. And the Premier is not doing his job. He hasn't been showing any leadership. To say he's not even really visible at all. But obviously he's being pushed by virtually everyone now, the business community, the medical officers of health from all across the province for some sort of vaccine certificate here, not one we can easily just forge on a Word document and print off ourselves. This needs to be done, and I don't know if anyone's ever going to get to persuade him to do this, but this is where the leadership is sorely lacking. And I don't know, perhaps the one that'll get to him now is the TD economists have come out and said that provinces that don't have some sort of vaccine certificate like BC and Quebec are going to have will do far worse in the recovery than those that do have one. So he's heard this message from the Chamber of Commerce, from the CFIB, the independent businesses. He's heard this from the healthcare professionals. Maybe now if the economists that predict where the economy is actually going get through him. But unless he does this, he is absolutely failing Ontarians. It has to be done.
Well, John, how is it that the Chief Medical Officer of Health in this province is the outlier among all of our public health officials, where 34 of them are saying we need to have our own vaccine certification cards, and we're going to do it with or without you? I mean, that just, to Keith's point, is a staggering admission of a lack of leadership at Queen's Park.
Well, there's two things to respond to this. The Premier actually is out and about. He pops up every day doing something.
He posts something on social media. He's not taking a question.
I understand that. And we know that newsrooms are stretched thin, so they're all following the campaign as opposed to just doing the Ontario stuff. But
or a tweet or a Twitter hashtag. I mean, they're all reporting on that.
I get that. But that speaks to also the chief medical officer, who has done two things. Number one, first of all, he pushed down the notion of a vaccine identity card for the first moment, like literally the first news conference he did. He talked through it as if he was a politician, and I was just like, you got to be kidding me. I mean, really? The second thing is he's now raised the bar. Guess what? We can all go back to normal when it's 90% vaccinated. Well, I'll tell you something. It's never going to get there. And it won't even get close unless you actually incent people to get close with a card, because that's now being proven in other jurisdictions and other countries. I don't know what's holding back the Premier on this. It's a simple thing that you can borrow now the technology that Quebec has actually implemented. I mean, you can do that here. It's a QR code. But I just come back to this simple thing. It's not ideology anymore. It's the ease of use for things in our society. So I got to tell you, standing in line at Maple Leaf to see a Maple Leaf game at MLSE and having everybody check as you go through a piece of paper that you could have manufactured at home, or, a little one that somebody's got to get out and it shows some really personal information on that. I mean, seriously, it's got personal information. I don't want people to know that. Is a ridiculous assumption. You've got universities, you've got businesses, you've got mandates being implemented. Premier is missing on action on this, and I tell you, it is a complete and utter lack of leadership, because 77% of the people in this country want that, and 74% of the people in this province want that. So this is an easy hoop to put the ball through, and I don't understand it.
Well, the problem here is that individual organizations, sectors are trying to do their own things. But even among the banks, there are all different approaches. Even among the hospitals, all different approaches. They're all kind of on the same, track in terms of having a policy, but they're treating it a little bit differently in circumstances. So, if you work at TD as opposed to RBC, there's going to be slight nuanced differences perhaps in how that all manages and how it plays out. So, yes, they're taking the initiative, but we need to avoid the chaos, as John Tory, Mayor of Toronto, keeps saying, we need that level of consistency. And it's got to come from the park.
It's just insanity that they're not doing it. I know early on, remember, we were all kind of shocked that they punted the whole response, basically, to getting out the vaccines to the provincial, the 34 public health units. We thought there should be a provincial coordination here. Eventually, it did work out, but it should have been a provincial coordination. This absolutely must be done by the province. Having something from Haldeman Norfolk when you go to check into a game to watch the Raptors, I don't think it's going to cut it. How are they supposed to know what's real, apparently you can alter these on a Word document really easily. So if you've got an official one that you actually got vaccinated, you can sell copies of yours and change the names for $5 a pop, apparently, and you can get them out. It's just insanity. This must be done by the province. And when you have, as you say, everyone, the medical profession, the business community, the universities, everyone looking for direction, having to implement their own, many of them paying consultants to come up with whimsical ideas that people who are against this kind of stuff will be able to challenge, because some of them won't make sense. Some of them will be different from one institution or other. Why haven't we got provincial leadership on this? With John, I just truly don't understand it, especially when the numbers are clearly there. He's facing an election next June, re-election, and he's just missing on this one. It just makes literally no sense whatsoever. We also had this week, it would have been bigger news than any other week, I think, when Dr. Fishman resigned from the science table. Said they were sitting on the news that we're facing a grim fall. They're sitting on the modeling. And the science table said, no, we're not. We've got other modeling to do. That modeling's not complete. Where was the Premier and the Health Minister to come out and say, Dr. Fishman's always been a critic of ours. He's always been a very accurate critic, but he's always been a critic. He's never been a fan of they weren't, again, it's just, we got a statement from that science table saying, we're still modeling. Where is the political leadership on this? And people are we facing a grim fall? Is the fourth wave really going to be that bad? And we're told it's going to be worse because we don't have vaccine certificates. Where is the Premier? Up north eating ice cream?
Well, two things on that. First is that we're not seeing that kind of regular update provincially in terms of, here's where we want to be and here's where we're likely to be. And I think your question's a good one, Keith. We're in the fourth wave. Let's face it. What's the circumstance going to look like as we move into the fall? Not a lot of conversation. Is that because the Premier's saying just be quiet about this? On the other hand, We got no Theresa Tam out there either doing this federally. And is that because the Prime Minister saying, oh, geez, don't be talking about a fourth wave while we're campaigning? So it's kind of cutting both ways here, where we've got both the province and the feds being pretty quiet at what I would think is a critical time in the fourth wave of the pandemic, John.
Well, let's define the fourth wave. The fourth wave is made up of 80 to 85% of people who are unvaccinated, and they are in the ICUs. Or in the hospitals, or catching it and staying home.
That's 80% of the new cases.
I mean, that's the fourth wave. Yeah. Sorry to say that.
Yeah.
But that's the fourth wave. I mean, that's it. So the real issue here, as I see it, Dave, coming forward, is actually not going to be those people who refuse or for whatever reason don't do it. We've got school kids going back. We have nothing from Pfizer yet. Apparently, they're going to come out with something in the fall, which has got tracking on kids and whether or not it's going to be an effective remedy. And the kids are going to have to get, booster shots or whatever it is on their, to stay at school or whatever. But there's nothing being talked about to address these issues. It is coming up on it. And the only thing I would say is very similarly to Justin Trudeau. When you are the leader of a government during a campaign, you're still the leader. You can't take a holiday from that. People will criticize you if you want to make it politic, but they will still accept it if you're a government leader and you have to do something for the country. In the same way, we have a provincial government that's working. We have working people he's relying on Kieran Moore to carry his spear every single time he addresses people. And I guess the whole thing I would say is he can't stay off the radar until after September the 20th. I mean, you just can't. You have to be doing something. And to Keith's point, putting out social media clips of just, eating ice cream somewhere does not cut it. So I think it's a lesson to both the Liberals and the Conservatives. You can't take time off from the job when you need to address something serious. And the last time that I heard this kind of call for, let's say that, the vaccine card was last March, when all the doctors and everybody got really angry and sort of said, we got to address this issue. Well, now you've got a different crowd. And guess what? They're the constituency that you've wanted to promote all the time. It's the business community. It's a business community. It's all the people that you've said, we're here to help you. My friends, we're here to, and go on about, developers. They're calling this time for this. So I think it's time that the Premier stepped up. Otherwise, he's going to have some repercussions over the long term as well.
Just a couple of minutes on this, because let's close the loop. With the Premier, not being as visible as we would like him to be. There, and I refer to the hashtag Where's Doug Ford. My sense of this, Keith, is that it's a Liberal taunt more than anything to draw him out. They want Doug Ford to step out into the light and be a target for the federal campaign. Yes or no?
Absolutely. And I suspect part of the big change that the Liberals will come up with next week, especially if they don't have any big new ideas, where we're told the Prime Minister is adverse to, flashy new big ideas at this point, is going to be then the boogeyman, Doug Ford's going to come back out. And Jason Kenney, he's going to campaign against these provincial Conservative premiers. Absolutely. That's what this is. This, where's Doug Ford? Well, we see where Doug Ford, people, that's clearly Liberal war room nonsense.
Yeah, it's not eye level, John, at all. I mean, most people who are just going about their business, I didn't even notice that we're not hearing from Doug Ford.
Well, I think you can stay below the radar screen because you can talk about certain issues that affect just the province. And the Liberals are not going to take a shot at you. I mean, the only response from the government on the vaccine, if there is one, is we'll wait until the feds put theirs together. And, I don't know why. But nonetheless, I don't think that it stops the government from doing its job. I mean, there are decisions which can be made, and you can use the health minister, or you can use Rod Phillips, or you can use somebody else to come out and say, this is what we're going to do. It doesn't even involve the Premier. But you have to give a semblance that you're not on vacation for the length of time that the Liberals are campaigning. And I think that that's foolish for the government to abandon governing. I mean, in the public sense, they're not abandoning governing, at all. But to take a complete backseat to everything and not address issues that need to be addressed in the provincial domain.
All right, well, we'll watch to see what the pivots look like over the coming days. Keith Leslie, John Wright, I'm Dave Trafford. This is The Daily Writ Race. It's an Eye Contact podcast.